Got a job for you, 621. This one comes from an independent YouTuber, goes by the name Talzian. Take a look at the request. Hey, it's your boy Talzian. Please enjoy the video and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thankies. Ooh. Huh. A strange request. Enjoy yourself, 621. But don't forget, we've got a job to do here on Rubicon. Commence mission. Objective is to like and subscribe. Get to it, 621. Watch that video. Let me open up this video game video review by saying that I have never played an Armored Core game before this one. I'll go even further and say that I generally do not care about the mecha genre in general. Not mecha games, not even mecha anime. Sure, I've seen Neon Genesis Evangelion and I've seen Gurren Lagann, but that's about it. Personally, I don't think this should matter, since a game or anime or any other form of media should be judged on its own merits first and foremost. And me not knowing or caring about the entire mecha genre as a whole, and not having an esoteric understanding of the deep lore of Patlabor or Gundam, should not impact my enjoyment of this single game in a major way. The reason I mention this is because I have noticed some Armored Core fans being fairly rabid about protecting the series in general. Some of them praising the new title for the things it changes, and others lambasting it for that because, of course, the old game has soul, and the new one is soulless. I simply don't really care. If a game is good, it's good, and if it's bad, it's bad. I know, only hot takes on the Talzian gaming channel. So anyways, with that disclaimer type deal out of the way, let's take a look at the core and its armor. Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon is, of course, first and foremost, a From Software game. This is an obvious thing to mention, but it does mean the game itself shares quite a few traits and quirks found in other FromSoft titles. AC6 has a stagger bar, for instance, just like in Sekiro. There's a type of stamina to manage called energy, like in Dark Souls or Elden Ring. You have an Estus Flask type healing system. You can find a Moonlight Greatsword, you know the drill. This also rubs off on the story and how it is structured, though it's a lot less vague than what I've come to expect from FromSoft's fantasy titles. The setup is essentially as follows. In the future, humanity has been busy colonizing space and revolutionizing warfare, as humans do, with the armored cores, or mechs, being the core of the most efficient military doctrine. Wars are fought between corporations through, among other things, mercenaries, of which you are one. Augmented Human C4-621. 621 being your serial number and C4 standing for the 4th generation of coral-based augmentation, with the 10th generation being the current one. Your old gen ass is sent illegally and as much under the radar as possible to Rubicon, a planet that was once home to a giant deposit of coral, which is your classic science fiction MacGuffin material, like Element Zero in Mass Effect, Spice Melange in Dune, or Dust in Endless Space. It is essentially a wonder material, capable of generating power and interfacing with electronics and whatnot, and also being used to augment humans. This giant deposit of coral got fucking nuked or something, and it all burned away in the event known as the Fires of Ibis. Or so they thought. Coral being a type of organic, self-propagating substance, it seems that, much like with regular life on our planet, there's no real getting rid of it, and it has been slowly building itself up under the surface over the 50 years since the Fires of Ibis that burned the stars. With the coral now being rediscovered, there seems to be a kind of gold rush to find it, which you are here to assist in and make some merc credits along the way. At least that's what I got from it. This all might sound grand, and it is, but as usual I'll dive deeper into the story itself later in the video. In any case, the game starts with you crash landing on Rubicon in your AC under the guidance of Handler Walter, who is your AC merc pimp or manager depending on how you look at it, and then the tutorial starts. This entire first mission or level serves as your tutorial. Think Undead Asylum in Dark Souls 1 or the Cemetery of Ash in Dark Souls 3. It's a fairly sizable area, with some fodder enemies sprinkled in to get you used to the controls and the combat and the movement and whatnot, culminating in a boss fight against a big-ass helicopter. This introductory boss fight, much like Yudek's Gundyr in Dark Souls 3, is your first real skill hurdle you have to get over to actually be allowed to play the rest of the game. I died a few times here myself, as I was still getting used to the feel of the game and the level of aggression that was suitable here, but after figuring out how to dodge certain attacks and exploiting the enemy stagger, it's really not that hard of a challenge. There also are actual tutorial missions in the game, but they do come after this first mission. The way these are drip-fed to you throughout I think the first chapter of the story is a little bit strange, but it is handy to get the actual details of how ACS works, what's a good idea and what isn't in terms of builds, how certain weapons work, the difference between different leg types, which is one of the most defining aspects of your build, stuff like that doesn't get explained anywhere else per se. Now, as I said, this is my very first Armored Core game I've played, and in general the feel of the game was very good. As you get to build your own mech with parts you unlock and buy down the line, the feel of the mech itself and how it moves really comes down to how you spec it out yourself. Do you go more of a lightweight build with a focus on quick boosts and darting around your enemies? Or do you go tank treads and drift around while peppering the enemy in a constant barrage of heavy fire while just tanking any damage that comes your way? Or do you use melee weapons and focus on a mid-weight build? Or do you focus on long-range attacks like cannons, or do you go for a full missile spam? When it comes to customization, there is a lot of gameplay styles you can go for here, which is always very cool to see. Personally, for my build, I did kinda stuck with the starting template. A gun to build up stagger, missiles for some added pressure and damage, a melee weapon for burst damage, and then eventually a cannon as added big direct damage for when the enemy got staggered. It was with this general template that I finished the entire game without any real major hiccups, aside from some issues on the game side itself, which I will get into later. Once you get used to the movement, stamina or energy management, and having 4 weapons to track at the same time, the game does start to give you more options over time as well. OS upgrades unlock new unique abilities, like the Assault Kick, which is a drop kick at the end of your assault charge. This move can come in clutch if you can actually land it, of course. The weapons bay allows you to forgo a shoulder-mounted weapon in favor of a secondary hand weapon, with the switch being quite fast, so it allows you to really keep the pressure up with that, without having to worry about reloads or overheating as much. And there's much more to unlock through OS upgrades. In essence, the game allows for quite a lot of freedom as to how you want to build your AC, even allowing you to reconfigure while on a mission if you die during one, putting you back at a checkpoint instead of having to replay the entire mission from the start. This ability to reassemble at a checkpoint is limited to the gear you have bought already, however, to not make it too silly I suppose, which I can totally understand. This is a great system, and I think that without these checkpoints, I would not have been able to kill the hardest boss in the game. Not without losing my sanity, at least. Armored Core 6 might also be the fastest FromSoft game I have played so far, with some enemies moving and attacking very fast, as can you. Thankfully, there is a hard lock-on feature that tracks and keeps your enemy in your field of view, as we've come to expect from FromSoftware titles, which is an absolute must when playing with a controller. There's also soft lock and free aim, allowing you to just aim where you want instead of relying on the less than perfect auto aim of your weapons, since most enemies can simply dodge out of the way of your big telegraphed attacks, as can you dodge out of theirs, of course. Using free aim on a controller didn't really work out for me, but for the few missions I did try playing with mouse and keyboard, it felt like that could be quite a viable option. In terms of that, the playing field is actually quite level, especially in your fights against enemy ACs like in the arena or in PvP. There's also no invincibility frames like you would get in Dark Souls by rolling, so in those terms the game feels fairly well balanced. For 1v1s, that is. Getting ganged up on by 2 or even 3 enemy ACs at the same time is quite difficult to worm your way out of there, especially since you can get stun locked quite easily in those situations, which is, of course, never fun. The UI also helps you in tracking your weapons, with your reticle on the enemy having these bars next to them, indicating how overheated your weapons are, how long they still need to recharge or reload, and how much ammo they have left depending on the weapon itself, of course. Usually I just relied on visual and audio indicators on my AC itself though, or just relied on my internal timer of thinking, my pulse blade is probably ready by now. Since the fights themselves can get quite hectic and you're not always looking at your reticle per se. But those fights being hectic is what makes them fun, of course, and the game can be a lot of fun when it all clicks. Like almost all modern From Software games do, you know? Dancing around an enemy, laying into them with suppressive fire, going in for the kick to stagger them and jamming an earshot round in their face and then blasting them with a pile bunker or laser lance to do massive direct damage. It is and can be a lot of fun. The audio feedback also helps in this regard, with the weapons having a good feel to them in general, thanks to meaty audio effects. Audio cues also helping combat itself, with the big attacks you should dodge always having a warning sound right before they go off, as well as having a visual indicator. Your own weapons have audio cues as to when they're ready again or when they're running low on ammo or are starting to overheat, I assume, as does your stamina bar, giving you a warning when it starts to get low, as well as when it's back online. Combined with the sounds your AC makes on its own, moving around and stuff, with the jumping and dodging jets, the weapons fire, hitting an assault kick in an enemy's face, and those enemies themselves having their own sounds they make, the soundscape in general here is very good and brings that extra layer to the gameplay itself. The one lackluster aspect of the audio was, surprisingly, the music. There is not a ton of memorable or impactful music tracks throughout the game, definitely not on the same level as Dark Souls or Bloodborne. Some boss tracks did stick with me, the Balteus fight one being the first track that really stood out and the second Balteus fight also being very nice, but in general it does sound like fairly generic electronic music, with some tracks getting repeated for different missions and whatnot, which isn't a bad thing per se, because there's quite a lot of missions. And this isn't to say any of the music was bad, and especially towards the last chapter of any playthrough the music did step up, but I doubt any track here will be as memorable as the stuff in Dark Souls, Elden Ring, or especially Bloodborne. And to round the technical things off, there are of course the visuals to talk about. The game looks decent for the most part, and has some truly amazing backdrops to some of the later game missions, where the sense of scale really gets going. This is an entire planet you're skipping around on after all, and there's definitely some missions where you, even in your 10 to 15 meter tall AC, feel like an ant crawling through New York City. A pain point may be that, throughout the game, everything does have a similar look to it. Everything being fairly industrial and whatnot, but there are some changes in scenery from mission to mission and chapter to chapter, though not as wide as a change like in Dark Souls or Elden Ring, maybe more in the line of Sekiro. The real kicker here is usually the visual effects of the weapons themselves, with energy weapons looking very nice and the coral weapons even more so. Some bosses have very flashy moves as well that can look absolutely stunning, though I'm sure it doesn't translate too well to a YouTube video with a limited bitrate. I have also seen mentions of the game not looking amazing or something along those lines, basically saying it's a trash PS3 game. And I do agree that maybe some texture work isn't that great, but I don't really expect that, you know? There's no reason to stop and look at some trees that barely come to the knees of your AC, or admire the industrial concrete buildings you're stomping through. The most important aspect for games like this is that they play smoothly, and I'll take good performance over amazing visuals any day of the week. Also, the important stuff does look quite good. The issue here is that the performance itself did have some hiccups for me, with the game even outright crashing at least once. These frame drops I had were almost exclusively present at big in-game events like the Strider going down for instance, and there were no moments I can recall where a frame drop actually managed to make me die in a fight or anything. But it did make those epic scale moments a little bit underwhelming when you go from 60 to 25 frames for a few seconds, you know? Moving back to the story then. In general, like I said, it is a lot clearer than what I'm used to in FromSoft games. There's no real need to look up lore videos to even understand what's actually going on. It's all made fairly clear in-game through the stuff you see and mostly the characters you interact with, or interact with you, rather. These characters are all faceless voice calls, more or less, but their personality comes off nicely enough in just the voice acting alone, for the English version at least. I did like the story in general. I think it got a little bit repetitive, seeing as you need 3 playthroughs to see everything it encompasses, and most of it is replaying the same missions, but it definitely has some cool moments, interesting characters, intrigue, and still a lot left up to discover and dig deeper into for yourself if you want to do something like that. I think that's about as much as I can say about the story without delving into actual spoilers, so if you don't want any of those, just click to this timestamp in the video. Regardless, I'll mainly talk about my personal experiences, opinions and interpretations that I made up myself. So I won't be diving super deep into the hidden lore and how everything is somehow connected to Dark Souls in some way or anything crazy like that. So, you have been warned. Time to talk a little bit more in depth about the story in a From Software game. Wish me luck. While the game starts fairly basic at first, with you building up a reputation before getting invited into the Cool Kids Club, towards the end of chapter 1 it definitely starts getting quite interesting. The characters you meet are interesting, be they Iguazu or Rusty, and at the chapter concluding mission you meet Best Girl, after getting demon-cored by the coral explosion. Air is pretty fun to have around, if only just because she gives you combat tips from time to time, as well as just rooting for you in general, which is just cute. And it's a welcome reprieve from having to listen to other mercenaries or Walter all the time. Once the coral is in play, and if you manage to actually beat the Balteus boss, coral is really all there is to the rest of the story. You help Carla, so she helps you get to another continent where the coral motherlode is supposed to be located, where you fight corporations for information on the coral, while fending off a big coral weapon made to protect the coral by people who studied the coral. Armored Core 6, more like Armored Coral 6. During your first playthrough, you don't get to choose much. I think there might be 1 or 2 choices leading up to the final chapter, which is just, do we kill these guys, or do we kill the other guys? So nothing really major. Once the Planetary Closure Administration starts getting involved for real, the stakes start to get pretty high though. Their suppression fleet cruising in after just having a hard-fought battle with just 1 of these ships was a very cool moment. And it also shows that this coral motherlode is pretty fucking important here. The Iceworm battle was pretty great as a visual spectacle, very similar to the Yorm fight or the Rykard fight or that one tree dragon fight in other FromSoft games. After defeating the Iceworm, the story starts getting more serious, though. Going underground, you find some interesting stuff, like archaic technology and old coral-based weaponry, the corpse being at each other's throats, including yours, and then the big reveals starting once you get to Institute City, fight the first Ibis weapon, and enter the final act of the game. In general, I think most things make sense surrounding the whole coral thing and the institute that studied it and developed all these technologies and whatnot. But it is strange how Walter mentions at the start of this Cell 240 boss fight that these Ibis weapons are designed to stop a coral disaster, one of which already almost happened, and one that you are actively trying to prevent with this weapon trying to stop you. Not very well designed for that purpose then, I guess. Though in this case the thing is being controlled by the coral itself, with the coral maybe being some sort of sentient hive mind in a way. The way Era talks about it, like the coral is her brothers and sisters, definitely make it seem that way, though maybe not exactly a hive mind, but more of a collective of sentiences spread throughout the physical coral itself. multiple intelligences running on the Coral cloud infrastructure in a way, I suppose. I didn't find anything that definitively explained what exactly air is or anything. There are some kind of things you can surmise, and it might actually be as literal as a human soul being subsumed into the coral itself, since air basically says as much when the watch point blows up and you were at the risk of being subsumed into the coral itself. The stuff Allmind mentions about air being a coral wave mutation also makes it seem like it's not exactly a human soul but something else, but still, she definitely feels very human for the most part. There's some text logs and stuff you can find in some missions, with the underground survey thing with air being the most fruitful here, and they do reveal some extra details on some hidden stuff, like alluding to Carla and Walter being related to the assistants of the main scientist who was working on the coral back in the day, which then ties into the whole observer group thing in the last chapter and why they know and care so much about all of this stuff going down. At the end of your first 2 playthroughs, you get a choice towards the end of the game, after basically all cards have been played and the xylem is revealed for the massive colony ship it is. And essentially, this choice boils down to this: try to destroy the coral, but for real this time, or try to stop Carla from destroying the coral and siding with air instead. My first choice here was destroying the coral, for the simple reason that I assumed it was in fact pretty dangerous to have around. You see all the things the Institute did with it, with them even hiding a lot of their coral tech for fear of its misuse. You see all of the havoc caused by the fires of Ibis, still smoldering corruption being left here after 50 years. So it is clear that the coral is volatile, and maybe humanity simply cannot be trusted with its potential, as all you see is corporations fighting each other for it and whatnot. Going for this ending, trying to destroy the coral, does pit you against some friendly characters, like Air and Rusty, as your agenda now clashes with theirs. The final fight against Air in her Ibis weapon was in my opinion the most enjoyable fight in the entire game. It felt fair while still being challenging enough, and it came off as a real clash of wills, which is always fun to see in a From Software game. Destroying the coral, however, comes off as the bad ending though, as these new fires of Raven burn away quite a lot. But perhaps it is for the best. The second ending has you siding with Rusty and Air against Carla instead, becoming a liberator figure for the Rubicon Liberation Front as well, helping them to take down the corporations and securing the coral for the Rubiconians, allowing them to gain some form of independence, presumably. This ending sees you face off against Walter himself, forced by Arquebus inside an experimental piloted Ibis weapon, and seems completely bug broken by the process. You are more putting him out of his misery here than anything else, and though you go against his wishes, he still respects you for finding your own wings, and still cares about you in some way. This ending I would categorize as the sad ending, because yes, you don't nuke the galaxy this time around, but that doesn't mean it's all sunshine and rainbows all of a sudden either. The most interesting part is tucked away in your third playthrough, however, where things start to change quite a lot. Allmind, the mercenary network and database that helps you throughout the game, is revealed as somewhat of a puppet master, being the ones behind the more mysterious events you come across in your missions, like the mysterious encrypted comms ghost mechs and the like. Allmind has their own plans for the coral, and in this third playthrough seem to see something in you they hadn't in the previous ones, making you a candidate for something called the Coral Release Project. This project essentially boils down to something Air mentions a few times, the possibility of symbiosis between humanity and the coral by actively inducing critical mass and causing a coral disaster, which is exactly what you came here to prevent. Going for this option then pits you against everyone else, and sees you following the directives of Allmind to facilitate this coral release, with Air being on board for this as well, as she comes to trust you and your judgment. These missions for Allmind are probably the ones with the darkest undertones, as a lot of people get killed quite ruthlessly and whatnot, culminating in essentially every named character being killed, either by you or by Allmind off screen. The culmination of this path brings you to the point of no return, Coral release is inevitable, but even then, All Might still has to wrest control over it by trying to eliminate you, using what I can only describe as the ghosts of the mercs you met ganging up to fight you, with Iguazu being the prime adversary here. He is the red gun who has been struggling against you ever since the dam assault all the way in chapter 1, and is filled with rage towards you as well as an inferiority complex, and has somehow sold his soul to All Might just to get revenge on you, which leads you to this two-phase endgame boss fight. This fight is probably the coolest one in the entire game, being fought in the same arena as the air fight, which is one of the coolest arenas in game, and air is here to join you, but on your side this time, for the first phase at least. The fight certainly isn't easy, but it is decently fair and is very cool, with you defeating All Might and Iguazu and firing off Coral Release. This true ending did remind me of two things with this final shot here. The third impact of Neon Genesis Evangelion, and, funnily enough, the symbiosis ending of Mass Effect 3, sharing visual similarities and thematic themes respectively. In general, like I said, I did like the story overall. It's a lot clearer as to what is going on in comparison to other FromSoft games, especially once you go through all 3 playthroughs to see everything it has to offer. This does make me feel a bit mixed on some aspects of the story though. The fact that it is a clearer told story makes me wish some more stuff actually got explored, like the PCA and their system. Every single PCA enemy shouts codes to their mainframe system that then evaluates what they have to do in response. And I suppose that the Ice Worm is supposed to be the big response reveal and PCA final boss fight, but it's just an autonomous voiceless coral weapon that wasn't even theirs but just an old Institute weapon. I did miss some general PCA related conclusion here. Same thing with Branch, it being kept vague in the first playthrough, the first time you fight off against the real Raven is okay, but even in the third playthrough, all it is just, you are strong, you will soar and carry our fire with you, and there it ends, you know, it's just, I think I wouldn't have had this much of an issue with these threads being left unexplored if it was in Dark Souls or something more vague and abstract, but maybe New Game Plus or New Game Plus Plus having more different missions to explore these two parts of the story with would have made everything more understandable in general, as well as alleviate my issue with repetition in general. While I generally and genuinely like the game and story overall, there are some issues to be found here that I do feel are warranted to mention in this video. I'll start with maybe the least important and silliest one. The custom decal system here is horrendously annoying to go through. I don't get how people make these insanely elaborate 100 plus layer artworks with the interface for this being so unintuitive to go through. There's not even basic mirror options to have the same thing mirrored on your headpiece or anything. Absolutely flabbergasted by this. Moving on to the real issues though. The first one on the list, the camera. Like in most, if not all, From Software games, the camera can feel like its own enemy sometimes. And while I did mention the hard lock-on keeping the enemy in your field of view, sometimes this can be a detriment. And sometimes it doesn't work perfectly all of the time. The biggest issue that came from this general issue was that hitting melee attacks especially was quite unreliable. I've had multiple instances where I missed a charged laser lance attack because my AC just aimed above or under the enemy, because you have to be level with the enemy for that attack to land, I suppose. This was why I used the Pulse Blade and later the Moonlight and Coral Blade for the most part, because these attacks had a very large hitbox, and the Moonlight and Coral Blade even being a ranged attack. The Pile Bunker feels great, the laser lance felt amazing, if you could actually hit them, which on a staggered, hard-locked enemy should be 100% of the time, but it didn't hit 100% of the time, and a single laser lance charge attack miss could be the end of it all in a fight like the Cell 241. It was in this fight, against this first Ibis weapon, that this issue was the most outspoken, for that simple reason that in a fight as hard and as fast as this one, everything counts. This fight was by far the hardest one in all 3 playthroughs I encountered, and was also very unfair, which is of course to be expected in games like this. When you assault charge in, and the enemy just backs away, backs away, backs away, backs away, and then fires an attack after you've run out of assault charge that takes away a third of your health, followed up by 2 more of the same attack, all while staying in the air permanently, that starts to feel a little bit unfair after 2 hours of doing this fight over and over again. It would of course be silly to expect every single boss fight to work under the exact same constraints as you have, of course, and the fight did get nerfed effectively, but some behavior just felt a little bit silly to me. Now, don't get me wrong, basically every fight was enjoyable overall. And I have since done this Ibis fight again after its nerfs, and it certainly felt better, mostly because the enemy doesn't two-shot you anymore, but there are similar fights in the final chapter that felt more fair before the nerfs, while still being a very enjoyable challenge. I wouldn't even have minded more of these super challenging fights, because the Cell 240 fight was the only one I really got stuck on for a long time. Place 2 and 3 going to the final fight of New Game Plus Plus and the Balteus rematch, which is New Game or New Game Plus depending on the choice you make. But still, the Cell 240 fight was by far the hardest one, even in those New Game Plus and New Game Plus Plus runs. In general, the difficulty felt well balanced though, aside from this one spike, so in general, I don't think the game being difficult in general is an issue in itself. I wouldn't be playing From Software games if I did think that, but in games like this and other From Software games in general, or Souls-like or whatever you want to call it, a high difficulty is only really a good thing if it is fair, and if the game itself isn't working against you, like with those laser lance attacks missing I mentioned. Moving on then, another issue, maybe a little bit more personal, was the repetition that is present here. Since finishing the story in its entirety means playing through the game 3 times at least, there is a sizable chunk of missions that you have to play through 3 times. Depending on the time frame you play these in and stuff, it can start feeling repetitive to go through the same mission you did 2 days ago for the 3rd time in 2 days, with maybe even the same build you had last time, just to see the same things happening and listening to the same dialogue again, without even getting a letter ranking for clearing it either. So if you want to get an S rank, which you need all S ranks for that one big achievement, you have to go through that mission at least 4 times across the board, usually more, because you won't get an S rank the first time around. Thankfully, most of these missions are fairly short, and if you know what you're doing, they can be over fairly quickly as well. But I'd at least expect a letter ranking if I do the same mission 3 times over in New Game Plus Plus. From New Game Plus onwards, some missions do have alternate versions though, and those can surprise you, with new missions popping up as well, so it does keep things relatively fresh, but the early chapters stay fairly boring once you've been through them once. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, I suppose. My final big issue, or final 2 big issues, is with 2 fundamental aspects of the game, these being stamina and stagger. Like I said at the start, I haven't played any other Armored Core game, so this is solely about this one. Why is there a need for both stamina and stagger on top of ammo management, overheating, and reload times? My experience with stagger in FromSoft games is based on Sekiro, of course, in which stagger dealt to you is a punishment for getting hit or blocking an attack instead of parrying an attack. This makes sense, since in essence, every single attack in that game is either parryable, dodgeable, or counterable in some way. This means that, in Sekiro, you can kill an enemy without being hit and thus staggered a single time. This works the same in reverse, with enemies getting staggered as you hit them and they block your attacks, with their stagger recovery being based on health, damage and pressure from you. The reason this works so well in Sekiro is that the flow of combat is very smooth. You can attack, dodge, jump, Mikiri counter, attack, dodge, jump, use your special ability, roll away, attack, do a special ability, jump, roll away, use your grappling hook, use your prosthetic ability, use a special ability, attack 4 times, dodge, jump, Mikiri counter again, all in sequence, because there is no stamina to manage, there is no stamina to speak of. You can and should keep constant pressure on your enemy, because there is no stamina to prevent you from doing this or prevent your enemy from doing the same. The only thing preventing you from a constant assault is the enemy themselves going on the offensive. In Armored Core 6, however, this is simply not possible, because you cannot keep up with the enemy. Every single boss fight outclasses you on this front, and I'm pretty sure all of the 1v1 AC fights don't use stamina either. With the Ibis weapon fights being the largest culprit here, of course, because they can just fly all the time. You cannot stay in the air forever, not even when having tetrapod legs, but the enemy can. You can't keep assault boosting forever, but the enemy can keep backing up forever. You can't keep up constant pressure because your weapons overheat or need to reload, but the enemy can just keep firing off moves as they please. Now, you don't need energy in AC6 to attack like you would in Dark Souls, unless it's a very specific attack like the Laser Lance charged attack or something. So why do fights in Dark Souls or Elden Ring, which also makes the fight unfair in this manner with energy stamina management, feel so much better to play? Because in those games, you have invincibility frames. You can dodge any attack in Dark Souls or Elden Ring with the right timing. Most of them at least. So it doesn't matter if the enemy keeps backing away like the Elden Beast does, or keep firing off attacks with no regard for stamina like Dark Eater Midir does, or whatever, because you can, purely through skill, dodge anything they throw at you. With, of course, the added caveat that rolling costs stamina, but unless you're spam rolling, you never really run out of stamina and roll windows. If you know a fight well enough, you can dodge every single attack with no issues for the most part. This is a lot harder to pull off in AC6 thanks to the lack of invincibility frames in general. You can dodge all big attacks, however, which are the ones that actually do a lot of damage, but that only works when you have energy left instead of having it all spent on assault boosts or staying in the area yourself, and you can still get staggered by the constant small amounts of damage you take from regular attacks. In essence, this feels like, to me, some sort of merge of Dark Souls and Sekiro combat, and it doesn't feel quite right. Especially when the times you do get staggered, you can't do anything for a few seconds and you usually get killed, unless you're lucky and the enemy doesn't attack you for some reason, which is to be expected from getting staggered. But when you stagger an enemy, they can often just dodge your big attack you fire off right away anyways, while still taking direct damage as a result of being staggered with a red stagger bar above their head, but just moving around, because why the fuck not, I guess. Which in general makes the real hard-beating combat parts not feel very fair all the time. In general, the game still feels good to play, and for the most part, these issues were not really a big deal, but when you do start to notice them, it feels like the combat design simply isn't on the same level as something like Sekiro, sadly, with Sekiro being my favorite combat in any FromSoft game, if you couldn't tell already. And to round off the issues segment of the video, or the critique segment of the video I suppose, I'll do a few rapid fire smaller issues. Why are there no indicators for missing hidden parts in the mission replay screen? Combat logs are there, so why not hidden parts too? The maps are visually so large, I don't feel like wandering to every invisible wall to look for a container that might not even exist in this mission at all. While there is a lot of customization, a lot seems to overlap with each other, especially when it comes to weapons, giving the illusion of more actual customization, even though in general there is still a lot of actual customization to do. I'm more talking about there being 5 different shotguns, all being just a shotgun, you know? The actual impact of stats like FCS or generator load or stuff like that are very vague and really need to be tested in the field to actually feel how big of a difference they make. Same with how certain weapons feel and perform. But there is a testing ground for that, where you can actually change up your build on the fly, which is pretty awesome, but stats like, oh, your arm specialization is 100. Like, what does that mean? If it's 80 or 100, what does it mean? Do I do 20% more damage? It's very esoteric, the way these stats have an effect that you don't really know about. And finally, I feel the game is somewhat overpriced. Compared to Elden Ring from last year, at the same price, Armored Core 6 simply has less in it. So I feel that 50 or even $40 would have felt fairer from a pricing standpoint, even though I don't regret buying the game for $60 at launch. In conclusion, I liked playing Armored Core 6. It obviously shares a lot of similarities with modern From Software games like Sekiro and Dark Souls, but it still has its own identity. The game generally feels good to play and experiment around in with different builds and the like, though it can suffer from repetition once you start getting into New Game Plus, as well as seemingly not having that many valid customization options. Some missions are fast and easy, others are intricate and challenging, with a surprising amount of variety from time to time. There are stealth missions, there are escort missions, there's kill missions, there's a surprising variety of missions from time to time. AC on AC combat feels great, even though there's really not that many AC bosses in the story itself outside of the arena. Big bad boss fights are cool, but there's not actually that many real boss fights in the game in general, compared to other FromSoft games at least. And sadly, it is there that AC6 lacks the most. In comparison to its younger siblings, since the Armored Core franchise is pretty old. Elden Ring has better exploration and a lot more things to see and do in general. Sekiro has a more satisfying combat system. Bloodborne has a better aesthetic, and they all have better soundtracks overall, in my opinion, of course. Armored Core 6 does have the cool story and setting, with a very fun and fast-paced combat system, but my general feeling is that especially Sekiro and Elden Ring are just better games in a lot of aspects. Would I still recommend Armored Core 6 then? Yes. But Elden Ring is, I think, the better game overall for the same price, even though it plays differently of course. And I did enjoy Sekiro more overall for also the same price. So I personally would recommend either of those two games if you haven't played them before, but Armored Core 6 is still a good game. But in my mind, it simply doesn't quite achieve the same level as either of those two. If we consider Elden Ring and Sekiro a 9 out of 10, I would say Armored Core 6 is like a 7.5 out of 10. And I do understand that this might upset people, especially some Armored Hardcore fans, but this is my genuine opinion after having played through the entire thing myself without really looking anything up, while still dreading having to replay every single mission for an S rank. I will not survive the grind. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next video, and I apologize for the slow release schedule, but it's a little bit busy. So I'll hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching again, and peace.
Smash it up, tourist.
Left shoulder ammunition at 30%. Right shoulder ammunition at 50%. AP at 50%. AP at 30%.
Using coral for fuel.
That was quite the show, tourist. How about we get back on track?